Thanks, Bruce, and good day, everyone. Great to be with you. Thanks for the invitation. As Bruce said, I'm Matt Travis, Deputy Director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency here in the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And first and foremost, sorry we can't be convening in person. I hope all of your family and network of friends remain healthy. I also want to commend everyone for continuing a focus on security. For the past 6 months, I guess now, obviously health and safety have been the forefront of everyone's mind. But that doesn't mean that security threats and security risks have gone away. In fact, even just over the past 3 to 4 days, we had a stabbing in Paris that looked as if it's linked to Islamic extremism. We had a failed plot or a broken up plot here in the U.S. to bomb both Wall Street and the Trump Tower. And even just yesterday in the U.S., we had a what appears to be malicious cyber activity against one of our major hospital corporations. So security needs to be ever present on all our minds, and I appreciate the organizers and all of you for keeping security at the top of your priority list. What I'd like to do this morning is to, one, introduce you or reintroduce you to CISA in the event that not everyone has heard of us. I think we still are the newest federal agency in the U.S. executive branch. And then I want to talk a bit about the threat landscape, particularly the cyber threat landscape, especially as we see it, and how that affects the transportation sector. And then get into some of the things about what we all should be thinking about and what we all should be doing to reduce that risk to this vitally important sector. So again, CISA, and you can pronounce it CISA or CISA or CISA. We don't care how you call us. We just want you to call us because we really rely on that partnership model of private sector and public sector working together. But we were created by an act of Congress that the president signed into law almost 2 years ago. And we are the leading civilian cybersecurity agency in the United States. We work across those 16 sectors of critical infrastructure, along with our partners in the federal civilian executive branch, as well as state, local, tribal, and territorial leaders throughout the entire United States. And we work with them to reduce risk to America's critical infrastructure from both physical and electronic attacks. So we have both the cybersecurity mission, but we also have the physical security mission, ensuring that our infrastructure is protected not only from acts of terrorism, but also from natural hazards as well. And so when you look at CISA, we have a dedicated cybersecurity division. Most of what we do there, in terms of, if you look at our budget, is to work with those 101 civilian executive branch agencies, everything from the Department of Veterans Affairs all the way down to the Bureau of Fish and Wildlife, to make sure that their networks are secure. We actually physically, I should say, we actively monitor and defend those networks through intrusion detection devices and other information sharing protocols. And then, so that's probably one of our biggest roles. But we also really serve the rest of the nation as both a sharer of cybersecurity related threat information and vulnerability information. And we also have capabilities to deliver flyaway teams to, if in an event that a city or a business is hacked and they call us, we'll have a team that can fly out and render support to them. We also offer, probably most notably to everyone in the audience here, a real whole range of malware reporting, vulnerability assessments, guidance, training, exercises. And so if you think of all the things we want to do to prepare ourselves or make ourselves more resilient, kind of left of an attack, that's where a lot of what CISA does, a lot of what we deliver to our stakeholders is in that area. And when you think about the physical security piece, we have advisors throughout the United States, protective security advisors, working with industry. Some of you may have worked with them in the past to better understand best practices, lessons learned, new technologies on how to make your industry, your company, your facility hardened and more defensive in nature to threats. And those advisors are throughout the country. We also have a leading role in emergency communications to ensure that those public safety communication channels and equipment are interoperable and reliable. And then we also have what's probably the newest piece is the National Risk Management Center, in which we look at systemic risk to not only those sectors, but I'll talk a little bit later to what new concept that we've introduced about a year ago, which is national critical function. So when you think about CISA, how we're different, we play defense. We don't play offense in the cyber world. And unlike our partners, where if you think about the intelligence community, whose job it is to kind of monitor and analyze threat actors, better understand them, keep an eye on them. And then you think about the FBI, whose job it is to go find those threat actors and arrest the bad guys, or at least indict them. Our role is to make you, our partners, better prepared, more informed, and more resilient against those global threat actors as it pertains to both your cybersecurity risk as well as your physical risk. And it's a mission that we take very seriously. It relies on this partnership model that I mentioned, in that unlike a lot of parts of the Department of Homeland Security, where you're kind of forced to work with DHS, whether you want to fly to an airport, you're going to work with TSA. If there's a hurricane in your state, you're likely going to be working with FEMA. You want to cross the border, you're going to be working with CBP, but no one really has to work with us. We have one regulatory authority over the U.S. chemical industry, both manufacturers and suppliers of chemical materials, making sure that they've got anti-terrorism standards that are maintained. But everything else we do is completely voluntary, especially in the cybersecurity domain. And so we really rely on almost a commercial mindset that if you are not engaging with us at CISA, if you're not listening to what we say, if you're not taking our advice, if you're not availing yourselves of the information we put out, then we're not doing our jobs and we're not raising the baseline of security for America's critical infrastructure. And when it comes to the transportation sector, that is vitally important for a number of reasons I'm sure we'll be discussing not only in this session, but throughout the day. And so when we look at that threat landscape, it is one that is becoming increasingly sophisticated, increasingly pervasive. And as we just look at how everything we do in international commerce, communications, everything's becoming more globalized, everything is becoming more interdependent, interconnected, and so frankly, that risk from a cyber attack is also a shared risk. And we're really at the point now that like-minded nations and like-minded companies need to understand that in this ecosystem, your risk is my risk and my risk is your risk, because what can start as an intrusion in one network can easily cascade into other sectors. We certainly saw that a few years back with both WannaCry and NotPetya, how malware, these types of attacks don't stay constrained often. And so that's something that I think is important in terms of the partnership. We all need to work together to make this more protective ecosystem. But in terms of those threats, great book. If you haven't read it, David Sanger, New York Times reporter, wrote one a few years back called The Perfect Weapon, which really chronicles the last 10 to 15 years of kind of the cybersecurity world. And in it, he paraphrases a former DHS official a few years back, talking about the range of threat actors. And at the low end, you've got folks who just hack for sport to see if they can get in. There are hacktivists who hack to advance social or political causes. And then as you kind of go up that scale, you get into the vandals. They may be doing something that is harmless but still damaging. We don't spend a whole lot of time worrying about those actors. But as you go up the scale of threat actors, now we're starting talking about those either individuals or nation states who want to steal your money, steal our money through ransomware, people who want to spy on us, invade our privacy, take our personal identifiable information. And then ultimately, kind of at the high end, where we really believe a lot of the risk resides, are the saboteurs, or those who wish to sabotage our critical infrastructure. And so when you look at those threat actors, all of those are bad outcomes. We're either getting our money stolen, we're getting our identity stolen, or someone is trying to jack up our infrastructure. And so it's a threat that is continuing to become more and more creative. And it's an arms race that really has no end in terms of how threat actors look to use information technology to advance their malicious intent. And so when we look at those nation states, you'll often hear us talk about the big four: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and they all have a bit of a different flavor to how and what they do and why they do it. And I'll kind of generalize here, but we certainly see China as one of those most consequential threats, because they're on an undeterred march towards global data domination, really for two purposes. One is to maintain the communist state there, and that's where we're talking about all of the PII, the data breaches to collect information on people, their names, their phone numbers, where they traveled, their social security numbers. And you saw this in the OPM hack. You see this in the Marriott hack. They're not hacking into Marriott to steal rewards points to book vacations. It is to create this database the modern surveillance state, which would make what George Orwell wrote about look like the minor leagues, in order to maintain global situational awareness on who everyone is and everything that they're doing. That's one track. The other track, which is really more consequential to all of us, is they use cybersecurity to steal intellectual property that powers their stated goal of dominating 10 industry sectors by 2025. The document, the strategy called Built in China 2025, talks about how China seeks to dominate those global markets, those sectors, in what will now be 5 years from now. And for this crowd, rail technology, ocean engineering, aerospace, those are just 3 of those 10 sectors that China seeks to dominate. And so they use cybersecurity, they use the theft of intellectual property as a way to kind of accelerate those aims. And so, again, it is something that is not theoretical. It is something that we have seen, and it's something that we grapple with every day. And it's incumbent upon really all of us to appreciate the nature of that threat. When we get to Russia, they tend to really just kind of want to cause chaos, and there's a whole conversation to be had about what they're doing and have done in the election space. But as it pertains to our critical infrastructure, they certainly have looked to scan, surveil, and even potentially target our critical infrastructure. Iran, similarly, whether they're preparing for their own expectation of military conflict at some point, they too seem to be focused on our critical infrastructure. And when you get to North Korea, frankly, they seem to lean more, or at least to lean a lot, towards ransomware and ways to actually, they use that to generate revenue to offset many of the international sanctions, economic sanctions against their regime. And so you'll see a lot of North Korean affiliated ransomware, certainly in the developing world. Again, you also have the unaffiliated and sometimes affiliated state-sponsored global criminal syndicates who kind of have their own agenda as well, whether it's to steal money or to steal things. And so none of those actors, none of those outcomes are part of what I would consider the community of nations and companies that have a respect for intellectual property, a respect not to target civilian critical infrastructure, an independent judiciary, respect for legal respect for individual privacy. Those are kind of the values that like-minded nations generally espouse and champion, and it's a common trait that those 4 and those criminals most certainly do not. And so, given that that's the threat landscape, if you think about, and this is really the lens that we look through most things, which is a risk lens. How do we lower risk? If you look at that traditional risk equation, threat and vulnerability, which is really probability times consequence or impacts. How can we lower that risk? It's very unlikely we'll ever be able to eliminate the threat. So how can we, when we think about what we do here at the Department of Homeland Security, how can we work with you to lower that risk? We almost see ourselves as the nation's risk advisor when it comes to critical infrastructure, because again, we don't own the infrastructure, we don't control it, but we certainly can help you become better informed, more aware, maybe better equipped to help lower that risk. And so one of the first things that we did is recognize that in the history of both DHS, but our predecessor organization, which was called the National Protection and Programs Directorate, which was very much like, it sounds like a bad DC acronym that kind of was a confederation of various programs. But now that we're at CISA, we recognize that in the past, what we've been doing is we got pretty good at holding a lot of meetings. There's something that some of you are familiar with called the NIP framework, the National Infrastructure Protection Plan framework, and it's got a whole governance structure that allows industry and government to sit down and to work through security issues through either a sector coordinating council or a government coordinating council. And there's a whole governance regime that manages that. And we got pretty good at using that to have a lot of meetings and do a lot of talking. But one thing we recognized that we weren't advancing the cause to actually reducing or lowering risk. And so the creation of the National Risk Management Center, which is really the newest part of CISA, is a recognition that we need to bring people in. And obviously we did this before COVID, so we do hope to get back to actually bringing analysts in to work with us in our spaces to not talk about the problem, but to actually work the problem. And what I mean by that is when you look at any sector, the transportation sector, you look at the financial sector, the electricity sector, there's vulnerabilities throughout. There's vulnerabilities from supply chain, there's vulnerabilities from outdated software, there's vulnerabilities from physical location. And what we do is, this is the methodology that we're employing in the NRMC, is to better understand where those vulnerabilities lie. Let's bring in industry, let's bring in academia, let's bring in government, not just us, but our partners like TSA and others, to better understand where those vulnerabilities reside. And let's then actually log them and map them and kind of start to understand where the interdependencies also exist, where what happens in this sector is going to affect this sector in these many ways. That's an analytical effort. That's not something you just do at a meeting. And so that's why it's incumbent upon us at CISA to encourage industry to send their analysts to work with us. We've got special authorities that are in the Homeland Security Act allow us to do that with surprisingly very little paperwork. And so we need to make better use of that authority to bring in analysts to help us better understand where those vulnerabilities reside, where those interdependencies reside, and then ultimately, let's model the impacts if there's an attack or degradation to these things. Because ultimately, once we understand where the impact is, what those consequences are, then we can't really understand the risk, going back to that classic risk equation. And so that was the thinking that allowed us to, or really propelled us to create the National Risk Management Center. But it also informed us to create a new analytical framework to work through. I talked about that, those 16 sectors of infrastructure. That had worked very well, again, for having meetings, but it wasn't necessarily a great model to actually do analysis. And so what we asked ourselves was, there's got to be a better way to think about this. And so one of the questions is, what are those activities? What are those industries? What are those systems and functions that drive our economy, that enable our security, that propel the American way of life? We call them national critical functions. And after about 9 months of working with industry and really all the stakeholders, we announced those national critical functions. There are 55 of them, or NCFs, things like the electrical grid, elections, the financial, the wholesale clearing function in financial transaction. These are these functions that if they go sideways, whether from attack or from a natural disaster, it can be a challenging day in America. And so when I talk about looking across the vulnerabilities and the interdependencies and the impacts and to lower that risk, we're talking about doing that across these national critical functions. And just in the transportation sector, we have a number of them, from the GPS, that's its own function, or position, navigation, and timing services. Transport cargo and passengers by air, that's a national critical function. Transport cargo and passengers by rail. Transport cargo and passengers by road, by vessel. These are 4 discrete, separate national critical functions. Transport materials by pipeline. You might have heard TSA mention their role, and we work with them on that in terms of pipeline security, as well as mass transit, manufacturing heavy equipment, managing hazardous materials. These are all national critical functions that are either firmly implanted in the transportation sector or certainly closely affiliated with it. And so against those national critical functions, let's understand where the risk resides. And then ultimately at CISA, we ask ourselves, what do we know? What are we going to do about it? And I kind of talked about the threat landscape and why that is, of importance enough that we've got to actively work to reduce risk. How are we actually going to reduce that risk? Maybe it's re-engineering a process. Maybe it's developing a new technology. Maybe it is a treaty or a sanction or some type of new authority. Whatever it is, let's figure out what we need to do to lower that risk. And And where government, at least where DHS, I think, sees our role is that we are in a position where we can look across all sectors. We can look across the entire risk landscape, and where we assess the risk might be, let's say the transport industry, the sector sees the risk being here. So then our job is to try to how we close that gap, because you might see the risk to your business, with your industry being at a certain level, and from a national perspective, we might see it to be a bit higher. And so that's really when we talk about what are we going to do about it, that's how we're thinking about lowering that risk. One of the areas I think a lot of work can be done to, in fact, lower that risk, working with many of you, is in supply chain risk management. And that really gets to the notion that, as I talked about, in this interdependent world where so much is dependent on information and data controls, industrial control systems, the Internet of Things, the advent of 5G, all of this puts even a higher reliance on what are those components, what is that software that are controlling and driving all of these digital functions. There's a lot of risk there, and there's a lot of risk because we often don't know where any one chip or component in a complex industrial process might come from. We don't always know where software comes from. We at CISA were the ones 2 or 3 years back that essentially banned the Kaspersky antiviral software from federal networks. We used our authority in the federal ecosystem after analyzing Kaspersky software, which frankly was very effective in terms of an antiviral software, but it was clear that there were vulnerabilities in terms of the client's data that we couldn't make assurances. And so when we look at that supply chain risk, we really look at 3 questions. One, are there technical vulnerabilities that can't be properly or sufficiently mitigated? Meaning, if technicians identify a vulnerability in the code, in how the software operates, if that can't be mitigated, well, then that's kind of strike one. Then we look at where's the software manufactured, where is the component, because it doesn't necessarily have to be software. Where is this manufactured? Is it manufactured in a company that has close ties to a government that could potentially be in a position to surrender its data to that government, or surrender its client list to that government, or make revisions to its technology based on authoritative government? So we look at the company that makes that software, and then we also look at that country. As I said before, do they have a respect for intellectual property protection? Do they have a legal system that respects privacy, that has an independent judiciary? These are the type of things. And if it's no, then to us, that presents a risk that is not only unable to be mitigated sufficiently, it's just an unacceptable risk. And that's what we did with Kaspersky software. And that's really what we're doing through what's called the Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force. And that's a lot of words. That's a federal group that it's partnered with about 40 of the larger companies in the information and computer technology sector, the ICT sector. And this has really been a pilot of how can industry and government working together better understand supply chain risk. And we've been at it now for almost 2 years now. We've just extended for another 6 months. And here is where we're trying to understand, one, how can we better share information, right? So one of the things that you as industry would probably want to know is just tell me what I'm buying, tell me what's in my systems, tell me what's in my vessels that control my navigation systems or anything else, or my port operations. And it's not always easy to find out. So shedding light on where components, subcomponents, multi-tier down components come from is part of this. And then also trying to devise what's a governance structure to manage this. I don't think certainly anyone in DHS wants to be seen as the arbiter of any particular product. We're not we want to be the consumer reports. But maybe there's a way that our cyber expertise, others in federal government, can be used to kind of almost like an Energy Star equivalent, saying that this product, we've got enough transparency and visibility to know that it's kind of past the threshold of certain standards for supply chain risk. And so that's one of the things that we're doing. The other thing that some of you may be aware of is the Aviation Cyber Initiative, or ACI. We we coach or share that with the Department of Transportation, as well as the TSA, as well as the Department of Transportation. And there we're working with industry to better understand where cyber risks to the aerospace industry, both commercial and cargo, reside, looking at ways to better understand how to reduce that risk, and really understand how to maintain a much more secure ecosystem for the aviation industry. There are other task force and projects that we're doing at CISA to work across the transportation sector. I won't get into all of those. Some of those will probably come up in the questions and answers. But I'll leave you with kind of a final section, which is what can you do? For those of you who are representatives of companies, one of the bigger things that we always stress is you need to know what you need to protect. Being aware of how valuable your data is really step one in understanding what type of cybersecurity regime that you need to install or you need to enhance within your own organization. Knowing what your data does for you will tell you how valuable it is to protect. The very rough equivalent would be if you're for a jewelry store owner, if you're selling cheap Chinese digital watches, you probably don't need a security guard and security cameras and all sorts of security. But if you're selling Rolexes, you're probably going to want to invest more in protecting those watches. Similar to data, understand what your data does for you, understand those assets on your network, and think about doing a basic business impact assessment of how you would continue to run your operations if you didn't have that data. That will inform you as to what type of investments you may want to make to protect that data. And then the other part that we often advocate is to ensure that whether it's your CISO, your Chief Information Security Officer, or your CIO, or your CTO, whoever has the portfolio for security, has access to the chief executives. That this can't be a mission support function that is kind of pushed in the corner. That you, whether you're a president, whether you're a COO, an EVP, that you should know what questions to ask your CISO or your CIO. Questions like I just said: what's on our networks? Do we know how many people have access to our networks? Do our contractors and subcontractors have access to our networks? How many access points are there? What type of information is stored? What's our configuration? Because when we get into really how to protect ourselves from the types of attacks that I've just discussed earlier, unfortunately, it's still basic blocking and tackling. I mean, that's a good and a bad. I mean, the good news is it actually doesn't take much to raise that baseline of security. We're talking about patching your systems, your operating systems, and staying abreast of vulnerabilities when those operating systems announce known vulnerabilities. Making sure your network is configured properly. There are security enhanced configurations, and there are configurations that can leave a lot of vulnerabilities to intrusion. Understand that you do have to update your software and not run old systems. And then you also have to make sure that you're training your employees. And I can't stress this enough. When you look back to some of the more successful cyber attacks, they come through phishing campaigns, where I think by this point, most of you know what a phishing email is. But do all of our employees throughout the organization, are they aware? Are they acutely aware enough to know what it is? They're becoming more and more sophisticated, more and more tailored. And it used to be back that the worst thing an employee could do for your company was to jam the copier or spill coffee on a laptop or do something stupid at a holiday party. Now with one keystroke, any employee in your company can literally wreck your entire network, cause a lot of damage, cause a lot of financial hurt there. So training your employees, it sounds very boring, it sounds very basic, and again, it's not just the send them a PowerPoint slide deck and have them verify that they read it. It really means to get in front of your employees or get someone else in the security field to do it, to make everyone more aware. So if we can do these basics, the blocking and tackling, if we can work together to better understand where risk resides, where those vulnerabilities are, I think we can go a long way to ensuring that not only the transportation sector, but all of those national critical functions, all 55 of them, have a raised baseline and a lowered risk profile. That's what we try to do here at CISA. Our motto is defend today, secure tomorrow. That speaks to that dual notion of any day today in real time, we are being attacked by either cyber threat actors, terrorists, or Mother Nature, or microbes from coronavirus. And we've got to be doing all we can to defend what's important to us, our critical infrastructure, our people today. At the same time, there's a long game, and that's secure tomorrow, whether it's how we build out 5G, how we better understand supply chain risk, how we work together to defeat those threat actors. That's the long game. That's the secure tomorrow. So I would just put a plug in that everything we do at CISA is free, whether you're in government or industry. Our services, our information, it's CISA.gov, CISA.gov, and I encourage you all to work with us. And I thank you for being here today. With that, Bruce, I'll pass it back to you. Thank you very much.